Welcome everybody to this talk. We are very, very excited to be hosting Pamela Frasch for a talk about animal law. So my name is Jeff Sebo. I direct the Animal Studies MA program at NYU, and along with my colleague Becca Franks, who will be doing the Q&A session a little bit later, we host this series of events sponsored by the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy about animal rights law and policy. And so Pamela is very kind to join us for this latest talk in this series. So I will first introduce our speaker and then tell you a little bit about how this session will go, and then we can go ahead and get started. So Professor Frasch is the Brooks McCormick Jr. Scholar of Animal Law and Policy and founder of the Center for Animal Law Studies. CALS is an academic animal law program with a focus on academic research, scholarship, and experiential education. The mission of CALS is to educate the next generation of animal law attorneys and advance animal protection through the law. Previously, Professor Frasch served as a general counsel for the Animal Legal Defense Fund, ALDF, a national nonprofit animal protection law organization that seeks to protect the lives and advance the interests of animals through the legal system. In 1996, Professor Frasch created the ALDF Criminal Justice Program, which has since assisted law enforcement and animal advocates in investigating and prosecuting thousands of animal abuse and neglect cases nationwide. And her bio then goes on for another like 10 paragraphs because she's done many interesting and impressive things, but I will stop there and invite you to read the rest in the invitation that we distributed. So we are very, very happy and honored to be hosting Professor Frasch today for a talk entitled Crossing Boundaries, the Critical Need for Global Animal Law Education. So we will start the talk in a minute, but before we do, just a note about this program and a note about how the session will go. So this talk is part of the Animal Studies and Environmental Studies programs at New York University. We have an integrated animal studies and environmental studies community where we study what animals in the environment are like, how humans interact with animals in the environment, and the moral and social and political and economic and ecological, et cetera, significance of animals in the environment and our interactions with them. And we have undergraduate major and minor in environmental studies and an undergraduate minor and a graduate MA program in animal studies. And we also have a Center for Environmental and Animal Protection, which conducts and supports and distributes high quality research about important issues at the intersection of environmental and animal protection. So if you have interest in any of those programs or activities, please do join our mailing lists or please do contact us and we would be very happy to talk with you about them. Finally, I just want to note, as I mentioned before, that the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy generously sponsored this event as well as other events in this series, and so we thank them for their ongoing support. Finally, the way this session is going to go is Professor Frasch is going to deliver a talk for roughly 40 to 50 minutes, give or take. And during that time, there is a Q&A function in the Zoom screen where you can both enter questions or comments, and you can also upvote questions or comments. So once we enter the Q&A portion after the talk, Becca will facilitate the Q&A essentially by asking Professor Frasch questions in the order of which ones are most upvoted and or interesting to Becca. So if you want to play a role in how that goes, please do enter questions and add your votes to the questions. Okay, with all that out of the way, thanks again for joining us and welcome Professor Frasch.
Thank you, Jeff, for those very kind remarks. It's my pleasure to be here today to talk with you about animal law and animal law education. And I do want to thank Dr. Becca Franks, Professor Jeff Sebo, Professor Dale Jamieson, the entire Animal Studies program at NYU for this opportunity, and especially Mari Roberts for handling all of the logistics and the details. Thank you, Mari. I'd also like to thank the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy for its generous support of this event and of animal law education around the United States and the globe. And with that, I'm going to share my screen. And there we go. And we can get started. I think all talks should start with a picture of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So here she is. And Some years before she passed away, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was interviewed by the New York Times Magazine, and she was asked how she could work with men over the years as the only woman in the room. And she responded, and I quote, "I always thought that there was nothing an anti-feminist would want more than to have women only in women's organizations in their own little corner, empathizing with each other and not touching a man's world. If you're going to change things, you must be with the people who hold the levers." Now, her response was intended to address women's advancement in the practice of law, but it's equally relevant to the development of animal law. Animal law as a field of practice and as a legitimate academic subject has succeeded in the past 40 years at engaging lawyers and law students who believe that justice compels the legal system to consider the interests of the most vulnerable in society, whether human or non-human. Because animal law has grown so dramatically in its stature among this particular group, it would be easy for animal law attorneys and academics to rest on their laurels. We could all just stay in our own little corner empathizing with each other, but such complacency would be unfortunate because there's never been a more important time for animal law education and advocacy. The pandemic has reminded us all of the real and present danger of zoonotic disease. More and more wildlife and plant species are disappearing, with another 23 species declared extinct just 10 days ago by the US Fish and Wildlife Service. And intensively farmed terrestrial and aquatic animals are being consumed in increasing numbers, which creates ever more alarming environmental, public health, worker safety, and animal welfare issues. Education, particularly education which leads to action and advocacy, is an essential part of any solution to these and other problems. And animal law education in particular has the power to fuel systemic change for large numbers of animals and humans. Oh, and by the way, I've peppered this presentation with pictures of happy and healthy animals. We so often deal with disturbing images of animal abuse. And although it is important to bear witness and to become knowledgeable about the many ways in which animals are suffering, I also think it's important to remember why we're doing this work, to remember that we aspire to create a world in which all animals are flourishing as they are in these photos. So animal law historically has been viewed as an outlier subject within the academy. Now that's changing, but slowly. We're starting to see some trends that indicate animal advocates are starting to capitalize on opportunities to influence the outside world where concrete advancements for animal protection can be made. The activity in the alternative protein space comes immediately to mind as an example. But this wasn't always the case. And in fact, it's only recently that our impact has been felt beyond a very small universe of like-minded people. Some 10 years ago, I co-wrote an article with Professor Megan Senatori that made the case for moving beyond preaching to the choir. And I think that strategy is still important. We want and need to be expansive and inclusive in our approach to maximize our impact to benefit animals. However, we've since come to the conclusion that continuing to expend energy on the choir members is just as essential as making new connections with those outside our circle. Author Rebecca Solnit recently explored this concept in both a Harper's Magazine essay and in a chapter in one of her books called Call Them by Their True Names. And by the way, both the article and the chapter are aptly entitled Preaching to the Choir. She argues that those who say we shouldn't preach to the choir misunderstand the fundamental purpose of preaching. She says, conversion or the transmission of new information is not the primary aim. The preacher has other work to do. Adults, like children, love hearing the great stories more than once. She then quotes Karen Haygood Stokes, a minister in Grand Rapids, Michigan, who said, "My task as a preacher is to find the places of agreement and then move someplace from there, not to change anybody's mind, but to deepen an understanding. Have we thought critically about why we agree?" So what does that mean for those of us who care about animal protection and rights? The movement is far more diverse today. We have found new and fresh perspectives. We've called in other disciplines, found common ground with environmental and other specialty lawyers, advocated for animals by focusing on how our fates are intertwined, and we've made great progress for animals. But if we were to heed Solnit's call to find value in preaching to the choir, does that mean that we abandon our outreach efforts? I think we've got to do both. So Megan and I are currently writing an updated version of that article that we wrote 10 years ago. And in it, we propose ways for the movement to continue its outreach, but also return to what brought us together in the first place. So as we look to the future of animal law, one goal of pedagogy, scholarship, and practice in this field should be to facilitate advancements in animal protection by finding ways to reach out more often and more effectively to those who move the levers of power, but also to find those people who already share our concerns and empower them with the tools and resources to do good work. But how do we find these people? How do we identify them? And how do we bring them into the fold, so to speak? Before getting there, I'd like to offer an overview of the success of animal law in recent years. And then I'd like to explore just one of the power levers that animal law attorneys must pull more often to create opportunities to advance animal protection more broadly. I'll then share with you how we have identified and supported like-minded advocates, particularly on the international level. And finally, I'm going to report on some very exciting work going on globally by some of the newest choir members, if you'll indulge the metaphor a little longer, who are proving to be highly effective animal law champions in their own countries. A paradigm shift is an effective redefinition of a field of endeavor. And it's in this role that pioneers really shine. A pioneer opens up a new domain and makes available a new field that can then be occupied by those coming later. In any great social movement, ideas are shaped and the boundaries are pushed by intellectual pioneers who have identified a wrong in society that must be righted. Pioneers are special people who cannot witness a wrong and do nothing about it. They insist on more from society. And in doing so, they are often met with criticism, anger, ridicule, and scorn for challenging the status quo. Proving the wisdom of the adage that no good deed goes unpunished, these visionaries sacrifice their time and their energy, their financial resources, and even their credibility to create for those who come later the privilege of a new field of endeavor. 40 years ago, there was no such thing as animal law as a defined field of academic study or practice. Sure, there were attorneys who loved animals, there were criminal prosecutions for animal cruelty, there were disputes over the ownership of animals, there were even some environmental lawsuits involving the protection of species. But animal law as a framework to consider the interests of animals in our legal system, that novel concept did not yet exist. It came to fruition through the dedication of lawyers who were frustrated by the historical indifference and failure of our legal system to meaningfully consider the interests of animals. The very first animal law course in the United States was offered in 1977 at Seton Hall Law School, and it was taught by adjunct professor Theodore Sager-Meth. Now today, animal law has been taught at no fewer than 165 law schools just in the United States, and in countless and growing numbers of law schools around the world. Acceptance of animal law within the legal profession today also reaches well beyond just the law school curriculum. Animal law is recognized by the bar on a national level through the ABA and the AALS, and there are at least 26 states who have created bar sections or committees devoted to animal law. In recent years, a career as an animal defense lawyer has even been listed as one of the top 10 hot or cutting edge careers for job seekers. Given the explosion of the field, it may seem as if animal law was embraced overnight. That was not the case. The efforts of many, many pioneers over decades culminated in the development of the field that we recognize today as animal law. Now, I'm not even going to attempt to name them all here because there were so many people involved and their contributions were too valuable to risk denigrating any of them by inadvertently omitting a name. But what's interesting is that their ideas once were considered subversive, radical, and to some even downright comical. Many of us remember when it was all too common to be greeted by other non-animal law attorneys making dog barking and elephant trumpet sounds. The fact that animal law is now offered at a significant majority of American law schools is an accomplishment that sometimes gets taken for granted by animal law students today. And that makes sense. They know of no time when the field did not exist. Environmental law broke down a similar barrier. Early environmental lawyers named their courses with nondescript titles like equitable remedies, law and science, and law and nature. Students enrolled in these vaguely titled courses critically analyzed the role of the law in environmental protection. Stealth is no longer necessary today. So these courses right now are simply entitled Environmental Law. Animal law educators utilize no comparably sneaky course titles, just a novel agenda to foster discussion in the legal profession regarding the interests of animals, living beings that the law traditionally has treated as lacking cognizable interests at all. Animal law proved itself unique as an area of legal study in that it analyzed the law from the perspective of the subject of study, the animals themselves. What we now call animal rights law or animal law began when attorneys consciously considered animal-related legal issues from the perspective of the animal's interests, when they began to view the animal as the de facto client, and where the goal was to challenge institutionalized forms of animal abuse and exploitation. As a result of this focus, however, animal law courses arguably tend to draw students already likely to view protection issues through the prism of animals' interests, even when classes are taught from a neutral perspective. Thus, while animal law has developed at an unprecedented pace in the last 4 decades, its success may be attributable to animal law attorneys simply preaching to the proverbial choir. Animal law can be viewed as simply an area of academic study or as an important component of a larger social justice movement aimed at more compassionate treatment of animals. Like other areas of social justice study, such as women's rights, civil rights, disability rights, or environmentalism, professors of animal law often wish to improve the lives of their subject of study outside of the classroom. To translate the development of animal law into real-world changes that better the lives of animals, those in this field must do more than convince those already predisposed to view legal questions through the prism of the animal's interests. How does the advocate make a compelling argument to advance animal protection, persuading those who are uninterested or disinterested in animal welfare? To make real advances, animal law attorneys must critically analyze issues and change social attitudes, and they must do so without simply appealing to emotion in response to the many difficult legal, moral, and ethical questions that abound when animal and human interests compete. The field of environmental law had to tackle the same predicament by finding ways to persuade those uninterested in environmental protection to care about the environment. Advocates moved beyond their converts and accomplished this task so effectively that today their cause is embodied simply by a color, green. This movement fostered such widespread support because environmentalists refused to stay in their own little corner of the world. Instead, they found ways to champion environmental protection by becoming adept at engaging those who hold the levers of power. They did so by moving several smaller levers, which then provided the opportunity to convince the powerful to change fundamentally how our society views the environment and to become stakeholders in protecting it. So let's just talk about one such lever, human interest. Human beings are a self-interested bunch. We tend to view ourselves as the center of the world, with the animals and the environment existing to satisfy our needs and desires. Although it's comforting to believe that an ethical epiphany or sudden moral consciousness spawned the Green Movement, it arguably was fear, rather than enlightenment, that proved to be the catalyst for change. At some point, humans recognized that by exploiting the environment, we ultimately were harming our own interests. So this human interest factor was perhaps the single most important lever in environmental protection. This shift in thinking about the environment has been called the Rachel Carson paradigm, of course, in reference to her classic book, Silent Spring, which brought to light the far-reaching social costs of pesticide use. In Silent Spring, Rachel Carson described the serious human health risks of pesticide abuse, including cancer, memory loss, liver problems, damage to the nervous system, and mental health disorders, just to name a few. A reading of her book really drove home people's personal stake in such issues and made them impossible to ignore. By contrast, animal law attorneys sometimes shy away from human interest arguments in favor of moral and ethical arguments for animal protection. Many animal law attorneys believe that humans have a moral and ethical duty to protect animals without regard to human interests. This should occur, they say, because animals have inherent value and independent interests of their own that ought to be respected. Regardless of the compelling nature of this argument, in my experience, this viewpoint is accepted by an exceedingly small percentage of the general public. Indeed, when animal and human interests come into conflict, human interests quickly, unsurprisingly, and universally trump the ethical and moral arguments favoring animal protection. In a well-known and entertaining debate over animal rights between philosopher Peter Singer and then Judge Richard Posner of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, and by the way, you can find this, it's an email exchange back and forth, you can find it at slate.com. The judge rejected the notion that humans have a duty to animals that arises from their own, meaning the animals' interests, and argued that most humans reject that view as well. Because of the self-interested prism through which most humans view the world, he argued, Posner said that philosophical arguments about animal rights will not, quote, expand and invigorate laws that protect animals. Instead, he argued that it is the human interest facts that will lead to measures that also reduce animal suffering. There is, of course, no way to confirm whether Posner is correct. On the other hand, the possibility that humans someday uniformly will adopt a collective worldview that animals hold interests in their lives that require humans to cease using them to serve their interests does seem unlikely. For example, one might consider that even though the sales of vegan and vegetarian foods have never been higher, only a fraction of Americans identify as vegetarians or vegans. According to a number of different recent studies, roughly 3 to 4% of the adult population, or about 10 million people out of 330 million, identify as vegetarian, with only 0.5% within that group identifying as fully vegan. What has increased substantially is the number of people, over 50% of the population, who choose vegetarian meals from time to time, even if they don't identify as vegetarian or vegan. So what's clear is that the vast majority of Americans, even those who love animals and concern themselves with their welfare, do not hold those views to such a high degree that they completely eschew eating meat or wearing clothes made from animal products. And that's not to suggest that Americans who are not vegetarians or vegans do not care about animal welfare, because again, studies show that the majority of Americans do care about humane treatment of animals. Caring about general animal welfare, however, is distinguishable from caring about animals because they have rights or because humans have duties to animals. Animal law attorneys must therefore broaden their horizons and advocate for animal protection by pulling the human interest lever more often. Doing so does not undermine animal protection arguments. It enhances them by recognizing that humans and animals often share interests that are more aligned than many people initially realize. In recent years, we are seeing this approach employed more often, particularly within the context of climate crisis. There is widespread scientific agreement that intensive farming practices are a major contributor to climate change. That issue, which directly impacts every human on Earth, offers plenty of human interest concern upon which to drive change. The fact that many improvements made to address these human interest concerns would also benefit the animals being exploited is actually wonderful. It's icing on the cake. It's good to know, in a way, that achieving animal welfare and rights goals is not necessarily reliant on basing the entire campaign on whether animals are deserving of those enhanced protections or rights. So if animal law is to continue to grow as vigorously as it has over the past 40 years, animal law attorneys must continue to find ways to present animal law in ways that will resonate with a wide swath of people of every ideological stripe. It seems an impossible task right now, given how polarized we've all become on even the most basic of issues, such as the simple act of wearing a mask. But crossing that divide is possible if we continue to approach the problem with creativity, compassion, and a willingness to really listen. By advocating human interest arguments, building outsider buy-in, and fostering diversity of viewpoint even within our own ranks, we can continue to build our movement because, in my view, I truly believe that there's a place for everyone to work together in this struggle. But what of the choir? In many ways, I feel like I live smack dab in the middle of the choir being at Lewis and Clark Law School. And by the way, that's not actually me in that choir, but it could be. I'm very fortunate to be teaching animal law at Lewis and Clark Law School because we have an administration and a staff and a student body that really understand the importance of this field and is fully supportive of its growth. Here are just some pictures of our campus that I thought I'd share with you. But interestingly, the animal law program at Lewis and Clark grew out of our environmental law program, which has been in existence for over 40 years. In 1993, some of the environmental law students told their professors that their principal environmental interest was in the wildlife. And they asked if they could organize a half-day wildlife symposium. And the professor said, okay. And that was the very first offering of what is now known as the Animal Law Conference. So the Animal Law Conference is celebrating its 29th anniversary this year and will be held virtually in just a few days from October 15th through the 17th. So I encourage you to check it out and register if you're able to attend, because it really is a great event. Just go to animallawconference.org. So that was in 1993, the very first Animal Law Conference. And then the following year in 1994, the very first animal law specific legal journal was established at Lewis and Clark, again, driven by student interest, these environmental law students. So this year marks its 28th year of publication. The first dedicated animal law course at Lewis and Clark was offered in '98, which I was lucky enough to teach as an adjunct. And between '98 and 2008, the program continued to grow somewhat slowly, but of course things took off in 2008 when we started the Center for Animal Law Studies. So, now we have this dedicated faculty and staff of 15. We've got 25 distinct approved animal law courses. We've got clinics and a summer law program. And we have the first ever Animal Law LLM degree program. We started the in-person LLM in 2012 with our first class graduating in 2013. And as of just a few weeks ago, we welcomed our first online LLM class in addition to our in-person class. So to date, we have welcomed 83 attorneys from 26 countries into our LLM program, most of whom have become animal law pioneers in their home countries upon graduation. When we first started the LLM program, we were hoping that eventually we would have some international students. And indeed, we welcomed our first international student in 2013, Jiri Bulliger. Here's a picture of Jiri, who is the executive director of Tier im Recht, the first animal law focused NGO in Europe, based in Zurich, Switzerland. But the trajectory of the international component has really exceeded even our high expectations. It's impossible to know exactly why, but I do think that it's in large part because there are members of the choir in all 50 states and in all 195 countries around the world. We just need to find each other, support each other, and collaborate with each other to make real change. Before the LLM program was launched, we would sometimes hear from law professors and lawyers from other countries who had heard about the work and the education that was going on over here in various universities, including Lewis and Clark. Or they would hear about us because of the conference or seeing our website. So they would sometimes reach out to us. And it was interesting because oftentimes there was this feeling of, where have you been all of my life during those early conversations? Because up until that moment, many of them had not met anyone else who shared their concerns for animal law. And sometimes we were invited to visit their law schools and law firms around the world and give presentations about animal law. Through those encounters, we started to develop an ever-widening circle of colleagues from around the globe, and through that circle began to identify and meet lawyers interested in deepening their animal law education by earning their LLM in animal law and bringing that expertise back to their home countries. We are also very, very cognizant of the fact that the US is somewhat unique in the world of higher education, in that most schools here have hefty tuition costs, whereas many countries in the world do not require any tuition payments from those accepted into their graduate programs. We did not want cost to be a barrier to access for smart, passionate, and dedicated lawyers, so we've worked really hard over the years to develop a robust scholarship program funded by some visionary donors to cover tuition, housing, meals, insurance, and related costs for a number of our accepted candidates. And knowing that some of our international graduates return to an environment in which they may literally be the only attorney in that country to focus on animal law, we created the Global Ambassador Program, or GAP, in the fall of 2020 to provide financial grants to empower and support our LLM graduates as they cultivate animal law education and advocacy around the world. We've been especially gratified to see some cross-border collaboration among a number of our graduates to work on issues regionally. So, for example, Lawyers for Animal Protection Africa, or LAPA, was founded by Amy Wilson of South Africa and Jim Krani of Kenya. And the Institute of Animal Law of Asia was founded by Ludmila Shige of Kazakhstan and Zihao Yu of China. So there are so many attorneys around the world doing wonderful work. And all of our graduates since 2013, I believe, are doing extraordinary work. But today, and I want to tell you a little bit about some of that work that's going on so you can see how animal law education is really having an impact internationally. And so I'm just going to focus on our most recent round of Global Ambassador Program Fellows who just learned that they've been chosen to receive grants to support their work this coming year. This is Ever Chinoda. She graduated in 2017. She is an attorney in Zimbabwe. As the founder of Speak Out for Animals, a nonprofit she launched as an animal law LLM student, Ever is the first ever animal law attorney in Zimbabwe, and she's devoted to wildlife protection in that country. She has conducted numerous trainings for attorneys, judges, and prosecutors on Zimbabwean animal law, and has launched innovative campaigns to increase public awareness and concern for Zimbabwean native wildlife, things such as a songwriting contest, walks for the animals, and the creation of PSAs for a variety of different types of media outlets. For wildlife law to develop in Zimbabwe, she also believes it's important to have statutes and case precedents consolidated in one textbook. And to be clear, that kind of a resource, which we sometimes take for granted here in the United States, does not exist in many countries in the world, and it does not exist currently in Zimbabwe. So now Ever is working on solving that problem. She's focusing on literature developed primarily by publishing a wildlife law casebook to be used by students, prosecutors, and magistrates in court to guide their decisions and judgments. In addition, she is introducing and will be teaching the very first animal law course in Zimbabwe. She is going to be teaching wildlife law at Zimbabwe University Law School. This is Alice DiConcetto. She is an attorney in France. She graduated in 2016. In March of this year, she founded Animal Law Europe, a Brussels-based consultancy that provides legal expertise to nonprofits and public administrations seeking to advance the interests of animals in EU law and policy. In the coming months, she's establishing her own nonprofit organization that will work alongside her consultancy, the aim of which will be to further develop and provide animal law expertise throughout the EU. Over this next year, she is focusing on 3 different publication projects. Number 1, a report on animals in the clothing industry in the EU. Number 2, a collection of student essays on EU animal law issues. And number 3, a quarterly publication of a newsletter with her research notes about pending and currently occurring animal law cases and legislation. So these projects will provide animal law experts and advocates with really high quality updates on the latest animal law and policy developments in the EU. And in this way, she hopes to create easier pathways for other advocates in France and throughout the EU to take on animal law cases, work on policy developments, and continue to advocate in new and creative ways. In addition to all of that, she's also teaching EU animal law at the Sorbonne, so she's very busy. This is Diego Plaza. He is an attorney in Chile. He graduated in 2020. While he was an LLM student, he founded the Center for Chilean Animal Law Studies, or CEDA, C-E-D-A. It's the very first center to specialize in Chilean animal law. So going forward, he is going to be working through both CEDA and another NGO that he just developed that aims to engage in direct advocacy to lead several different actions to advance non-human interests in Chile. On an academic level, he's coordinating activities in schools and universities, and through his advocacy NGO, he is leading strategic litigation projects, which are in process, but I'm not at liberty to discuss today. He's also helping to lead Subjects, Not Objects campaign, which is trying to include non-human animals as legal persons in the new Chilean constitution. In addition, he's got a huge project this year because he's going to create the first animal legal publishing house in Chile. And he's going to be doing something similar to what I just said Alice is doing, trying to get information out there about Chilean animal law, but also he wants to explore intersectional literature on animal issues from non-legal, intersectional, and feminist perspectives. More pictures, Diego. And this is Hira Jalil. She is an attorney in Pakistan. She graduated in 2020. As the only attorney in Pakistan to have an LLM in animal law, she intends to develop an open access website that will contain a repository of information about animal law in Pakistan. And she's conducting a number of webinars on animal legal developments in Pakistan, along with researching and writing the first ever comprehensive textbook on animal law in Pakistan. She also is using her funding to institute or continue strategic impact litigation on behalf of animals in Pakistan. One such lawsuit that she's currently litigating is a case before the Lahore High Court against the indiscriminate culling of street dogs by state authorities. She is also working on a case in that same court regarding wild animal welfare, in which the petitioners are seeking to ban the possession of wild animals as exotic pets by individuals. As part of her work, she's drafted a model Animal Rights Act for the province of Sindh, has reviewed draft rules under the Punjab Animal Health Act of 2019, and is currently drafting an Animal Welfare Act for the province of Punjab. She also routinely writes on animal welfare issues and women's rights issues, and her work has been published in various news publications in Pakistan, the US, and the UK. This is Tony Gerrans. He is an attorney in South Africa. He graduated in 2019. Tony is now working with Humane Society International as the Executive Director of African Operations. In this role, he directs work across Africa in 4 program areas: working to protect wildlife, farmed animals, companion animals, and those used in testing. As a GAP fellow, he's working with another animal law LLM alumni, Tess Vickery from Australia, to present a seminar on global animal law for anyone interested in recent animal law developments around the world. And by the way, that is happening on Thursday, October 28th, so I encourage you to check it out. In November of this year, he's going to speak at the 5th Annual African Animal Welfare Conference, scheduled to be held in Accra, Ghana. The theme of the conference is One Health, One Welfare for a Better and Greener Tomorrow. So Tony's going to be presenting on how the One Welfare framework might be used to advance legal protections of farmed animals across Africa. Some of the things that he will focus on include: how do we address the question of food security, animal welfare, environmental and human health in an integrated way in an Afrocentric context? And how can stakeholders embrace African conceptions of nature and animals? Is there a better alternative than Eurocentric legal constructs to protect African human and non-human animals? This is Ludmila Shigay. She is an attorney in Kazakhstan. She graduated in 2020. In recent years, the themes of animal protection, animal conservation, animal cruelty, and the role of animals for public health have come to the forefront of social and political debate in Kazakhstan. In fact, the president of Kazakhstan has indicated that prevention of animal cruelty is a serious matter of concern for the modern society that Kazakhstan aspires to be. Currently, the government of Kazakhstan is discussing a draft law on the responsible treatment of animals, which Lou contributed to. So it seems like Kazakhstan is poised to make some strides forward, and Lou is really hoping to push things in that direction. As I mentioned earlier, she co-founded the Institute of Animal Law of Asia along with Zihao Yu of China. And now Lou is embarking on another project she calls the Kazakhstan Animal Law Research Center that will serve as an educational platform for students, advocates, policymakers, and others across the country. So some of the goals of the center include comparatively analyzing Kazakhstan's animal legislation with those of other countries, integrating legal research with recent scientific research and current ethical considerations, identifying animal law trends in Kazakhstan and creating and submitting proposals for improving current animal legislation, and developing animal law as an autonomous, fully fledged legal discipline, both in academia and in practice. This is Gladys Kamasanyu. She is located in Uganda. She is a 2020 graduate. Gladys is the chief magistrate of the Uganda Wildlife Court, which is Africa's first and only specialized wildlife court. It's located in Kampala, the capital city of Uganda. Now, a bit of history. Gladys, along with two other judicial officers, were tasked with establishing the court. And she was highly involved in advising the Judiciary Administration of Uganda on how best the court could operate. And in 2017, the Uganda Wildlife Court was officially launched. As you can imagine, Gladys has successfully adjudicated over many high-profile wildlife cases as part of that court, involving a number of illicit wildlife products like elephant, ivory, pangolin scales, live pangolins, rhino horns, and hippopotamus teeth. So over time, she's really gained a wealth of experience and interest in the area of fighting wildlife crime. In addition to being chief magistrate, she is the founder and CEO of Help African Animals, a 501c3 that she formed during her time with us as an LLM. The organization is based in Uganda, where it currently operates, and it also has an office in Kampala. Through that nonprofit, Gladys is designing, producing, and distributing a compendium of all animal protection laws in Uganda to make available to advocates and local communities. Her hope is to spread knowledge about animal protection laws to other Ugandans to create awareness, foster change, enable effective enforcement of the law, and of course, to combat wildlife crime and crimes against animals. And the last person I'm going to talk about is actually from the United States. This is Tara Cooley. She graduated in 2020. And after she graduated, she was hired as an animal law teaching fellow at the University of Connecticut Law School, where she is implementing several new projects related to Connecticut's Courtroom Animal Advocate Program, or CAP law. Tara is working with UConn law professor Jessica Rubin to implement a new specialized animal cruelty diversionary program to address the absence of an accelerated pretrial rehabilitation program that meets the needs of cruelty offenders. And Tara and Professor Rubin are also providing training and support to various states to assist in the development and implementation of CAPs nationwide, including the development of a multi-state CAP implementation guide. So I really hope that 40 years from now, scholars will look back to this time as the moment when animal law began to gain global widespread acceptance, and when opportunities that we cannot even imagine today were born. Recommitting to the animal protection and animal rights principles that we share with other like-minded advocates is essential to recharging our batteries and refilling our reserves of energy and creativity that get sorely depleted through the course of our day-to-day work. But this shared communion must be paired with our willingness to move into the great unknown and connect with those we haven't even met yet, and who on paper may even appear hostile to our cause. We never know where the next great idea will be generated, nor do we know which ideal will catch on and change the world. So to quote Stephen Hawking, let's boldly go where no one has gone before, and where the future of animal law is yet to be written, hopefully by all of you as its authors. Thank you. I look forward to our conversation coming up.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a really inspiring talk. Yeah, we're just thrilled to hear about all that. The scope and the diversity of the projects that are happening and the countries around the world is just absolutely inspiring. And I know you say that, you know, we can't expect things to happen quickly, but it does seem to be sort of a real faith change compared to, you know, it's just really remarkable. So we have a bunch of, so thank you. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but.
Well, I agree with you. What's so exciting to me is to see the creativity and the passion and the energy that is bubbling up all over the world, and that people are finding each other and they're working together in ways that are really creative and getting more done because they're able to pool their resources and their brain power. So it is a really exciting, I mean, there's so much work to be done, and we know this. We don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about it at all, but it's also so reassuring and exciting to see what is being done and that people are really committed to the work.
Yeah, and I guess on that note, I just off the top of my head, I have a question that, you know, are in this global perspective that your program is fostering, are there any examples that you can pull for like really strong legal frameworks or techniques or approaches from other countries that maybe wouldn't have occurred to us here, but because you're bringing in this global network, are there just examples of countries, for example, that are doing things better or getting pieces of the puzzle better?
Oh, there are examples of that where people, especially regionally. So what's interesting is that different countries have different legal systems. You know, we have the common law system, other countries have the civil law system. You know, so sometimes what works in one country won't translate exactly into a different legal system. But oftentimes, especially when you look at some of the regional partnerships that are being developed, it's interesting because we see people in Kenya and South Africa and Tanzania and Uganda, they're all working together because they do, I mean, they're very different countries, but they're on the same continent and they have some of the same shared interests because of the wildlife that crosses borders between their various countries. So they've been able to work together really effectively to think about, okay, here we have these laws in this country, maybe we can work over here and try to develop something similar. What's going on with your constitutional court? Okay, this is what's happening here. So we are seeing that kind of cross-pollination of ideas in ways that are being successful, or at least getting it started on the path to success. So yes, that is happening.
That's fantastic. Great, thank you so much. So we have a bunch of great questions here. So I'll just start with the one at the top. An anonymous attendee writes, thank you so much for this talk. Given the importance of highlighting the connection between non-human and human interests to advance animal protection law, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on efforts to establish legal standing for non-humans separate from interests of humans. Thinking of the Non-Human Rights Project, for example, I can imagine ways in which establishing legal standing for non-humans would, of course, benefit humans with that framework, but I'd love to hear your perspective, particularly on how to make that concept more palatable in what still seems like a very anthropocentric field. Thank you.
Yes, and that's a great question. And so thank you, whoever posted that question. You're absolutely right that so much of the law is very anthropocentric in its posture. So for example, if somebody harms your companion animal, you can sue for emotional distress if the facts are supportive of that, but it's your emotional distress. It's not the animal's emotional distress, even though the animal is the one that suffered the actual harm there. So we see a lot of that going on. And yes, a lot of people, a lot of organizations, and most prominently, of course, the Non-Human Rights Project are working to try to get through that barrier. It's a significant barrier. So up until, I mean, throughout history, we have, you know, legal persons, and human beings are considered legal persons in our system. And then you have legal things, and property encompasses legal things. And of course, animals are considered property. We are seeing some movement to recognize that animals are not like a chair or a table. And, you know, one example that people don't often think about, but it's true, is that are the anti-cruelty laws. I mean, I can take a hatchet and, you know, tear up my desk and nobody's going to care. If I did that to my dog, lots of people would care. It would be a felony in most states. So we are already recognizing that animals are not like other forms of property. However, there's a limit to that. Animals still cannot sue in their own right. They still are completely dependent on the whims of whatever the human owner wants to do with them. There are no restrictions in being able to kill your animal. If you want to kill your animal, you can't do it cruelly, but you can still kill your animal. So there's still a lot of work to be done. Some commentators are suggesting that what we need to do is develop a different third category, something that some people call living property, or some people call quasi property. And going that route, they say would number one, it would provide the animals with some opportunity to engage directly in the legal system through a guardian ad litem or some other mechanism, but yet still recognize that they're not fully legal persons. Other people, of course, like the Non-Human Rights Project and others are saying, no, that's not enough. We need to go all the way to having animals be persons. I tend to be a bit of a political pragmatist. And so I tend to think about what can we get accomplished to the benefit of animals as soon as possible. And I'm really hopeful that the Non-Human Rights Project is going to have a big breakthrough. And I'm sure all of you have been following the Happy case. And so things are happening there. And that would just be wonderful. But if that doesn't happen, I do think maybe looking at some of these other alternatives while they continue to work on their habeas corpus matters and other people working on their matters, it could be a way to break through that barrier, at least a little bit, to provide more access to the legal system for animals. So I hope that answers your question. But it's a tough issue. It's kind of at the heart of everything that many of us are doing.
Yeah, if it's okay, I might piggyback on that question. Along the lines of this, how to define animals legally and like what strategy, inherent value versus human benefit. I wonder if anybody's ever talked about, rather than seeing it as a human benefit, downstream consequences for human line of argument, or we just need to elevate, the status of animals and have them inherently valued. Within the human line, like, is there any conversation about reconsidering or even just problematizing our definition of what it means to be a human as a strategy for having a more inclusive understanding of humanness and, the fact that we contain within our bodies, many different DNAs that are, different kinds of microbes and stuff like that inside of us, just on a very sort of like crude biological level, this idea of us being this, separate from the environment, separate from the rest of the world way of seeing the human is also part of the problem, and not necessarily biologically true, and also not culturally true, or historically true in terms of the way of thinking about the human. So to have a more expansive view of the human, I know that's a little bit wacky, but I wonder if anyone's ever thought about sort of questioning that angle.
Well, it's not wacky. It's people are talking about that very issue in the way that you've constructed it. It is really interesting, is particularly with technology. What does it mean to be human anymore?
Yeah.
I mean, some of these conversations are bubbling up around artificial intelligence. I mean, there is talk about, should we have legislation that says you can't beat up your robotic dog that looks like a real dog because of what it might mean for how we're treating actual dogs, for example. But also, if you think about, organs on a chip, or, xenotransplantation, I mean, the lines, it might seem like science fiction, but it's kind of here, right? And so, and the lines get very, very blurred. I do think looking more carefully, and this is going to be a job for the ethicists, and I know that you have some wonderful ethicists there at NYU who are thinking about these issues. But how do we define animal? How do we define human? The fact that there are such blurred lines, and that what separates us is not nearly as great as what brings us together. How do we move forward, and then how do we integrate those new concepts into the legal system? Part of the problem is that the law oftentimes lags behind. I mean, just for example, you may have seen the news, but yesterday there was a bipartisan group of senators who introduced into a new bill which would update the Depression era FDCA law that requires animal testing for certain types of medications and procedures. I mean, that was signed by Franklin Roosevelt in 1938. It's taken that long after everything all that we know about the advances in technology and science and research and testing for us now to get to this place where if this bill becomes a law, then it will say it's not banning animal testing, but it's saying you don't have to do animal testing all the time if you've got other better alternatives. I mean, that I think is such a good example of some of the challenges that we face, where we have a legal system that oftentimes lags behind the science. I mean, you're a scientist, I'm sure you see this all the time. You know, some of the rules lag behind the science, they lag behind sort of cultural preferences and what society wants. So some of it is just like trying to nudge our system forward so that we can have a little bit better alignment. And I think that the issue that you've just identified is just right at the heart of a lot of that.
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, that and it's a bipartisan, you know, what a sort of like torch to carry, that this great bill is bipartisan as well. Yeah. Okay, so now a tough question. Thank you. This is another anonymous attendee. Thank you for this great talk. How would you describe the relationship between animal law and punitivism, tougher penalties for animal abuse? And I guess, you know, this very difficult problem of weighing sort of violence against animals and then leading to, you know, incarceration and forms of violence against humans. And then of course, if that's happening, I'm ad-libbing now, but, you know, happening within the context of the US legal system and how that's not really playing out on a level playing field. So yeah, how do you describe that relationship? How do you think about weighing those issues, the really tough issues?
Yeah, another really, really good question. So it's an area that's being debated a lot right now. So Justin Marceau, who is a professor at University of Denver, is somebody who is very prominent in this field, and what he argues is that what has happened with the strengthening of the anti-cruelty laws is that it's not necessarily helping animals all that much, but it is penalizing disenfranchised and marginalized people through the criminal justice system, and that the criminal justice system is a problem. And I know that, for example, Tara Cooley, one of her projects, as I mentioned during the presentation, is she's working at UConn to try to think about diversionary programs so that people who have been convicted of animal abuse are not necessarily going to jail or to prison, you know, that there are ways to manage these things differently. So here's what I see is really at the heart of it. Not that long ago, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, the anti-cruelty laws were very, very weak. There were very few felony anti-cruelty laws. You could pretty much do anything you wanted to an animal at any time with virtually no consequence. Prosecutors didn't take it seriously, police didn't take it seriously, nobody took it seriously. And it was a real problem. So over the course of about the following 20 years, most states tried to strengthen their anti-cruelty laws, and making the worst forms of violence against animals, not all animals, let me just say, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, but you know, especially companion animals, making those a felony. But the problem, of course, is that the laws exempted huge swaths of animals, farmed animals, where the worst of the worst abuses occur, were completely exempt, as were specific farming practices. You know, hunting wildlife was exempt. All circuses, rodeos, lots of practices were exempt. So you were really looking at this sort of crazy system where if you were a dog, I often say, if you need to be a dog in the United States, if you need to be an animal in the United States, be a dog, because you're going to get the most, and of all the animals, you don't want to be a chicken because they have zero protection. So it's a real problem, and part of the concern is that by only criminalizing abuse against certain animals and not all the animals, it actually continues to entrench some of the problems that we see within the criminal justice system. So the bottom line for me is that I think the criminal justice system has to be reformed. There's systemic racism. There are so many problems with the criminal justice program system that I think is implicit in the person's question. They're aware of it. We all are aware of this. So that needs to be fixed. What I don't want to have happen is go back to a time when animals just don't matter. And you can pretty much do whatever you want to any animal at any time, and it just doesn't matter. I would rather have at least some protections and work toward getting more protections than having no protections for animals. So I think there's a balance. And I don't think that commentators like, Justin and others are suggesting that we don't have protections for animals. I think to the contrary, they're very strong animal advocates. But I think we, if we are in a position to be able to redesign some of these issues and some of these laws, I just hope that we keep the animals at the forefront of our mind, so we don't go, in order to help one constituency, we're not inadvertently harming another constituency. And it's going to be a little bit of a tough balance, but the questioner is absolutely spot on. It's a very complicated and difficult issue, and one that needs a lot of attention. The good news is that a lot of people are focusing on that right now in an intersectional way. So I think we're going to be seeing some really interesting developments in the coming few years.
Do you think there's a possibility for some both and sort of response to this, where it's yes, animal cruelty is a problem and we need to take it seriously in the law, and we need to continue to take it more and more seriously, and the tough penalties and in equal distribution of punitive measures in this society also needs to be worked on? And it's a chance to talk about both as, we need to do both of these things. Yes, both of them.
Absolutely. Yes, 100%. And if I didn't make that clear in my response here, absolutely, that's what I was trying to say. Is that, we have to work on both of those elements. And I don't think they have to be mutually exclusive. You can do both. You can, we've got to reform the criminal justice system. It's terrible, as we've seen. I mean, we know this. So, and we need to make sure that animals receive protection, and not just dogs and cats and other companion animals. We need to expand that. So it's a huge lift on all fronts, but lots of people are working on trying to get there.
Great. Yeah, no, that was great. Super clear. Thank you. So the next question is, where or how would you like to see social enterprise integrate with animal law?
So by social enterprise, I'd be curious to know what they mean by that phrase. How do you interpret that, Becca, since I know we can't necessarily get the questioner to provide more detail?
I think, given what I know about our audience and in general, I think wondering about how animal law can integrate. Yeah, I guess I'm not sure. I was sort of interpreting it as sort of animal advocacy groups or nonprofits, and coordinating between the two. But maybe that's not what was meant. Along the spectrum of possibilities, what would be most interesting for you to?
So, well, I'll go with what you just said, meaning, so you have animal law, which are attorneys and academics and other advocates, typically who have a law degree. And then you have a lot of activists and advocates who are not necessarily focused on the law, but they're focused on different practices, and they're focused on trying to make a difference. If that's what we're talking about in terms of the social enterprise, I absolutely think we can and we do work together. They really do go hand in hand, because so often when you're trying to make a change on a social level, it's easy to get, well, not easy, but it is possible to get a business to stop doing X, Y, and Z. But it's more powerful if you can then back it up with some type of a sort of legal regime which encourages or supports or prohibits or whatever it might be enforcement's another question. We all understand that just because you have a law doesn't mean it's going to be enforced, right? But nonetheless, having sort of the force of law, having sort of the social construct that is changing, having those things working together, as well as consumer education and all of those tools, I think that is the most powerful way to approach it, so that you've got a lot of different entry points to actually ensure that the change gets made and that it stays that way and continues to evolve and become even better. So yeah, I love it. And I know that over the years, even though I'm a lawyer and, I mean, I've worked a lot with lots of different groups that are not legal groups, and some of them are the most effective, most powerful people in groups, and they're getting stuff done, and it's really inspiring. And I always really enjoy playing a tiny role and being supportive however I can.
I guess this sort of relates to a question that I have about the law, as a scientist, and I'm learning about the law as much as I can, but I really am, I'm very much a beginner. But one of the things I think that just some recent cases, including the abortion ban in Texas, has made me realize that I had sort of always assumed that this is very naive and wrong of me, of course, but that like being a lawyer was understanding the law and then sort of like figuring out how to apply it. But there's also clearly this other version of like being incredibly creative and taking action and doing and connecting and generating new spaces and new ways of doing things and new ways of that are not given to you in the law. And I wonder if that's one of the things that comes out through these sort of interfaces with external groups where you have, just a whole diversity of minds working on a similar issue, and you have that sort of a chance for those creative links to be made or something like that, or, there's certain ways that we're doing things, but maybe there's ways that even within existing laws, there's room for kind of like unexpected progress or solution making that isn't really given. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but this idea of like, this generative process and like a creative process also being involved. And
yeah, that absolutely resonates with me. And I think that in animal law is also unique. We're, as I mentioned in the presentation, we're a relatively new field of law. I mean, when you think about traditional areas of law, torts, contracts, I mean, hundreds of years, I mean, just going all the way back, thousands of years. And animal law as a field of study and discipline is relatively new. The other challenge that we have is that we don't have a whole bunch of laws at our disposal. So if we compare it to environmental law, they have, I mean, the 70s were kind of amazing for environmental law, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, all sorts of federal laws were passed, or all sorts of state laws. Animal law, we have some laws. They typically tend to be the state anti-cruelty laws, and we have some other laws, but we don't have this robust, endless pool of laws that have been around forever that we can draw on. So one of the things that I like to say is that if you're going to go into animal law, you have to be creative and you have to be scrappy, because it's not going to be handed to you. You're going to have to really think really outside the box, to use an old cliche, but it really works here, because we may not have the animal law specific law that we can use. So we have to look to other areas. We have to look at family law and environmental law and probate law and property law, and try to find sort of those little chinks of those little entryways. So there's a lot of creativity that is going on. And particularly getting back to the very first question, because of the person-property divide, which makes it difficult to even access the legal system oftentimes on animal issues. So yes, there is absolutely a generative process that occurs often with people who are practicing this area and working with non-legal advocates. I mean, we have to know what's going on the ground. And so getting that information from the on-the-ground advocates is essential. And they will often have the best ideas in terms of what would actually make a difference. And then our job is to figure out, okay, if we try to get there using the legal system, how do we do that? Are there any laws or pathways that we can access to make the difference in the way? And yes, it can be very creative, and oftentimes it doesn't work. You have to be scrappy, creative, and be willing to lose a lot, because it's we're still growing this as a field. But then when you are able to make a breakthrough, it's pretty exciting and pretty wonderful. So yes, it's like I said, not a wacky question at all. It's very, it's like, no, it very much resonates, and I like that very much.
Thank you. Okay, so our next question is, what is your realistic long-term vision for the future of animal law? And in particular, this questioner is asking, to what extent is there a consensus over the vision? And are there some, in your view, important points of contention?
Boy, these are really good questions. So my realistic long-term view is that we can make change, but it's going to be incremental. As much as I would love for there to be a moment when suddenly the dam bursts open and we're able to see the kinds of developments that would make such a difference for animals, I don't think that is going to happen. Typically, it doesn't happen in any field using the law. Typically, it is, not always, but typically it's incremental. So my realistic long-term vision is something that we're going to be able to make some change. It's going to be incremental. I also think that there's a lot of promise in alternative proteins and in that space. But again, I've been interested and surprised to see that as those products have gained in stature and in market share, so has the consumption of animal-based products. So I'm not. I think we're going to see some incremental change, but I'm not sure we're going to see any approach that's going to suddenly, make this huge difference. And so we all have to sort of be working on these issues. The other thing I like to think about is that the front is long, meaning that you don't know which strategy is going to work, and you don't know which issue is going to really resonate with the public or with legislators or policymakers. So it's really important for all of us to be working on all of the different areas that we're working on. You just never know. But then that leads to one of the other questions that was in what the writer had presented, which is, what are the points of contention? And I do think one point of contention is how do we deal with that person-property divide? Again, as I mentioned earlier, some people are saying, no, we just need to smash through. Other people saying, no, we need to be a little bit more incremental. Other people are saying, well, let's at least just focus on these species who have capacities similar to what humans have, because we can understand that and they're more sympathetic. Other people saying, no, that's very anthropomorphic, it's speciesist, we're going to leave all of the other animals behind. So you really get a lot of debate in that space. And you also get a lot of debate in terms of, some people are saying, if you do try to develop a third category, like a living property, that's going to mess up, my efforts over here to try to create, personhood. So don't do that. And other people saying, no, this is what you're doing is interesting, but it's not going to happen. So we need to do this. So you sometimes see that. And it would be really lovely if we would all sort of coordinate and work together all the time. And that does happen a little bit sometimes, but of course, lots of different creative ideas and lots of different creative people are trying different approaches. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this answer, you just never know which one's going to pop. So we'll see what's going to happen there. But I would say that might be one of the biggest areas of contention right now. Is just that within the field. I mean, externally there are other, like, should we be eating animals? Should we not be eating animals? I mean, some of those things, but that goes beyond just animal law.
Yeah. That's a great outline map of that. Thank you. So we have a bunch of questions. I think the global, work that you've highlighted and the work that you're doing at Lewis and Clark to support students and is just so inspiring. So we have a few questions along those lines. And one attendee, let me see, I've lost it now, was expressing, this desire to take courses and not being able to travel, or their online versions, hybrid. Many of us are very interested. And then similarly, Brad Goldberg asked, how do you decide how to allocate grants in the Global Fellows Program? And is there an application process? And how does that work? And maybe even how it ties up to some of these bigger ideas that we're talking about in this, larger landscape. So if you could talk a little bit more about the grant allocation process and how people can get involved from around the world.
Absolutely. And by the way, hi, Brad. I haven't talked to him for a while, so it's nice. I can't see you, but I'm glad you're here. So yes, I'll start from, I think, the beginning question, which was, how can people access this? And what's exciting is, again, I mentioned, so we have this LLM program and we launched the online version of it. So we have both an in-person and an online version of the LLM program. And so no matter where you are, you can apply for, and if you're accepted, you can take this course. It's a part-time program, so it's going to take you 2 years to get the LLM doing it that way. If you came to us in person, it's full-time and it would be 1 year for the LLM. But what's exciting about the LLM, the way that we've structured it, and I'm one of the people teaching the first cohort in this first semester, so and it's been really wonderful. We have students from all over the world, but we also have a number of Americans. And what's been really great is that it's asynchronous because we have different time zones going on, but we're also creating opportunities for all of us to actually talk to each other by Zoom, because I just think there's no substitute for some of those personal relationships. And we want the LLMs to be fully integrated into the community of LLMs that is continuing to grow, because we're seeing some really amazing work. We do have, as I mentioned, we have tuition grants, and people have to apply for it. And it's, we have a committee, they look at all of the applications. It's a combination of everything from, your interest and your background to your academic record, to references, to a writing, it's just the normal thing. We also look at need, and we're trying to continue to build the number of scholarships available. With the gap funding, which is what I think Brad was specifically asking about, the fellows, yes, there is an application process. And what we do is right now it's only open to our LLM graduates. And the point of it is, as I mentioned, is to provide support to people who are out there doing this work, because it can be really lonely when you're the only one or one of only a few people in a country working in this field. So we want them to be connected to this larger community, and we want them to have the support to be able to do their work. And the support can go a really long way depending upon the country. So we do have an application process. What they have to do is they have to provide a lot of detail about how they intend to use the funding. And what's the purpose? What are the objectives? What are the deliverables? So we really, because it's competitive, we have, like I said, we have 83 graduates so far, and it's going to continue to grow. And we have a lot of people applying. So we gave out 7 this year, and we just focus on, okay, here are people who are doing some really exciting work to really advance the ball in animal law advocacy and education. So let's support them.
Great, thank you. So there's another question here that I think is along the same lines, but a step back, if I'm interpreting it correctly. And someone who doesn't have a background in animal law, but interested in pursuing and supporting animal law, what advice would you give as best course of action? So, before you even, what to build a career towards an animal law career. And I'm sorry to the attendee who posted this if I'm misinterpreting it, but I know we have also an undergraduate audience here as well, courses of study, majors, that sort of thing. And then also, I guess, anything in outside of academia that sort of supports you in being likely, I guess, to get into an animal law program, and then also being able to make the most of it when you're there.
Yeah, those are, again, good questions. So for people who don't want to go to law school, but they do want to be able to gain more information about animal law, there are, and this answer is going to have multiple parts because they asked really good questions with multiple answers. But there are ways for somebody who's not a lawyer to be able to access some really great content. And I'm just going to give you some examples. Number one, so at Lewis and Clark, I mentioned we have a summer law program, animal law program. you can audit those classes. A couple of them are online. One of them is in person. It's taught by Steve Wise, who runs the Non-Human Rights Project. So that's always wonderful. But so you don't necessarily have to be a lawyer to take, you have to get professor approval, but we've never had somebody turned down just because they're not a lawyer. You wouldn't be getting credit for it necessarily, unless you were able to work it out with, if you were an undergraduate, it's possible. But you would be able to access the content, you'd be able to meet the other students, you'd be able to interact with the professor, and it's really powerful. There are 2-week intensive courses. And so you're in there, it doesn't take up your whole summer, but it's full immersion. So that's one way to do that. I also know that Brooks Institute right now, who funded this wonderful event and funds lots of education around the world, they are in the process right now of putting together sort of this Animal Law 101 series of videos, which I think they're going to make available just to the public. And they're very, very wonderful production values. And I think, so there are going to be those types of resources available where people can access it. I also think that if you're an undergraduate and you're interested in going to animal law, into law school because you want to practice animal law, right now, I think if you can take some philosophy classes, I know that if you're at NYU, you've got an amazing environmental studies program. So there are some related areas of academia that really will serve you well if you go into law school. It's not essential. So don't worry if you're like, in your senior year and you don't have really that option anymore, don't worry about that. The goal when people are looking to go to law school, what we have found is that the people who are successful are those who have been successful as undergraduates, regardless of their study, their area of study. You can be a music major, you can be a chemistry major. And in fact, oftentimes having people with those types of backgrounds really adds richness to the classroom, and you bring different perspectives to some of these issues. So just try to do as well as you can so that you have lots of options. And if you still have time to shift some of your schedule, I would say, try maybe some political science, some philosophy, some ethics classes, some of the environmental law classes. All of that would really give you a nice base from which to work and then be able to translate that into, I think, a really successful law career.
Great, thank you. So this is another sort of tricky question, but a really important one, and also maybe an opportunity for the both and, creative sort of embrace of trying to do a lot of things at once. And this comes from Paul Locke, who says, thanks for the great talk. Can you discuss how to go about outreach among communities that might not have animal welfare and protection as their first priority? What is the strategy to get allies, and what issues do you think are the issues that are most likely that we can organize a coalition around which we can organize a coalition?
That's a great question. Thank you, Paul. And also I need to give a shout out to Paul Locke, because Paul was one of the people behind the bipartisan bill that was introduced yesterday. He's a scientist and a lawyer at Johns Hopkins. So Paul's doing some tremendous work in that space. And he's also one of our professors who teaches an animal testing law and ethics class in our summer program. So thank you, Paul. That's a great question. Yes, that's an issue that comes up fairly frequently, not only in the United States, but around the world. Why should we care about animals when we've got human rights issues, when we've got poverty, when we've got violence against women, when we have so many other issues going on? And one of the ways that I like to think about it is that, it's really all connected. So by working on one issue doesn't mean that you don't care about the other issues. And by working on one issue, you can actually help find some solutions for some of those other issues. And I also feel like if we all just sort of worked on what we felt passionately about together, we would really get so much accomplished, right? But your question is really, how do we reach out to those communities? And I know that I'm going to use actually an African example right now because it's so clear, and I like it so much. There is a veterinarian by the name of Sherry Speed, and she founded a chimpanzee sanctuary in Cameroon. And her principal focus was the chimpanzees, of course. And I think, gosh, they have something like 80 or 90 chimpanzees now in this huge, beautiful sanctuary out in the middle of the forest. But the problem, of course, was that it was in this area where there was profound poverty, profound unemployment, profound hunger, lack of access to medical care, everything else. And what she realized was that, you know what, these people are not going to care about the chimpanzees as long as they are really struggling with some of these other issues. So she really started to address, in her small way, she's only one person, but still in a very effective way, how can we make a difference for the community? And so she started, she only hires people from the community to work at the sanctuary. She provides, medical care to the people in the community. She's providing employment. She's been able to get different people to really understand sort of the importance of the chimpanzees to the overall economy and just their own value, of course. But it's been transformational for that community because she recognized that, yeah, why should they care about these chimpanzees when they are struggling so much? So how can we make sure that we're serving all of these different constituencies? And I really love that example because I think that it's a way to approach some of these issues, which we can do in a lot of different contexts. I mean, that's a very sort of dramatic example, but I think we can do that in smaller ways too. If we think about, and it kind of gets back to the human interest point that I made earlier, if we think about what do people care about, and if they're dealing with issues of violence or poverty or whatever it might be, how can we address that and work with the animals as well? Is there a way to address all of those concerns that make sense so that we're lifting up the humans as we are lifting up the animals? I don't think those are inconsistent approaches. And I think that, again, if we just employ a little bit of creativity and some compassion, we can come up with some great ideas.
Well, thank you. I can't thank you enough. That's such a beautiful story and inspirational, but I think very grounded and realistic about the challenges we face, and it's just nice to hear. It's more than nice, but it's just really wonderful to hear all of the work that you're doing and the examples that are coming out, and the powerful messages that are being carried around the world and brought back here as well. And it's just a beautiful thing. So we can't begin to thank you enough for all the work that you do and for sharing your work with us today. And thank you very much to all of our participants and for the lovely questions and for creating such a rich discussion. And thank you for the Brooks Institute, and thank you to Mari for setting us all up so well. And did I leave anyone out, Jeff?
No, I think you got it.
Okay.
And I just want to say thank you to both of you, and Mari, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful. I've so enjoyed the experience. And I do invite anybody who was listening and who wants to engage in more conversation, please don't hesitate to reach out. I love meeting new advocates and reconnecting with advocates I already know. And let's continue the conversation. I think it's only when we're talking with each other that we can come up with some of these ideas to move the needle. So don't ever hesitate. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good afternoon.
Bye.